See so many members so keen to speak in this debate, which has been too long delayed and unfortunately is too short. In fact, it's been almost a year since we've had a government housing debate, and when the Secretary of State told us in December that housing remains the government's top priority, it's a pity he hasn't made it his top priority in his diary today. Nevertheless, it is good to see the No, it is good, however, to see the Housing Minister speaking for the government today. Never mind telling the House that the housing is the government's chief domestic priority, as he did. He told an industry conference in February that once we get beyond Brexit, housing will be the government priority. And I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, given the mess that this government has made for more than 2 years on Brexit, and that we've got a Prime Minister in Europe today begging for an extension just so we can move on to the next stage of negotiations, this really bodes badly for the government's future focus on housing. And I have to say to the Minister, Brexit is a very feeble alibi for a totally non-Brexit department with 6 ministers and 2,000 civil servants. Nevertheless, I did enjoy his speech, but I have to say to him, the story that he tries to tell is so at odds with the experience of millions of people up and down the country that he and his colleagues risk sounding complacent, risk sounding like they just don't get it. They don't get the public's anger and frustrated hopes at a housing market they feel is rigged against them. They don't get the despair at being 1 in a million on council housing waiting lists when the number of new social rented homes built last year was just 6,453. And they don't get the lives blighted by bad housing. Children, I'll just finish this point. Children growing up in temporary accommodation hostels, renters too scared to ask landlords to do the repairs, and young couples stripped of hope of home ownership, stopped from starting a family or putting down roots, and they don't get that a systematically broken housing market demands wholesale change and cannot be fixed without big action from government. I give way to my friend.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. It's just on that point. Isn't it ridiculous that we have a situation where, like in Hartlepool, we have in-house poverty and people literally living behind boarded-up windows for over a year just because they're scared of raising it as an issue with the local authority or with their landlord?
Well, my honourable friend, unfortunately, despite good landlords and many tenants being satisfied with what they rent, describes the experience that too many of this country's now 11 million renters face day to day. And the government simply can't carry on, after 9 years in government, talking about what they're going to do, because what they're doing at the moment simply isn't working. I will give way to the honourable friend.
9 years and what we're about to do. But is it not accept that housing starts, for example, are roughly 100% higher than they were at the low point under the Labour government in 2009. And if he's not sure about that, just speak to any brickie, any chippy, any sparky, and they'll tell you they're a lot busier than they were back then.
Well, I tell you what, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable member's got a very short memory. 2009 was in the direct aftermath of the global financial crisis and recession, and it was the action the government took then to keep house building going and help pull the country out of the crisis. And I have to say to the honourable gentleman, house building, more than a decade on, under this government, has still not reached the pre-crisis peak. It's a pitiful performance over the last 9 years. And the one thing the public have lost patience with is a government that tries to blame, 9 years on, its previous Labour predecessor. So, Mr Speaker, the government's own record now, I think, is very clear. The rate of home ownership, lower, with almost 900,000 fewer under 45s owning a home now than in 2010. Homelessness, higher, with the number of people sleeping rough on our streets more than doubled since 2010. Private rents, higher, with an average tenant paying £1,900 more than in 2010. And social house building, lower, with the last 2 years the lowest on record in this country since the Second World War. And I just say to the Minister, if this government had only continued building social rented homes at the same rate as Labour did in 2009, in this country today, there'd be 180,000 more of those homes. That's more than enough to house every family in temporary accommodation, every person sleeping rough on our streets, and every resident in every homeless hostel throughout the country. Now, the Minister said, in response to an intervention from my honourable friend, we're very close to rehousing all those involved in the Grenfell Tower fire. But I have to say, nearly 2 years on from that shocking national tragedy, the government action is still on go slow. And in fact, the figures, which the Minister would not give the figures to the House, but 1 in 10 of those from the Tower, 1 in 3 of those from the wider estate involved in the Grenfell Tower fire have still not got permanent new homes. And I say to the other, also to the Minister, for those residents in other high-rise blocks around the country whose buildings are still clad in the same Grenfell-style cladding, 8 in 10 still have not had that removed and replaced. That's the residents in 354 other high-rise blocks around the country, nearly 2 years on from the Grenfell fire. Of course, I give way to the Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I wanted just to correct the right honourable gentleman on the numbers on Grenfell rehousing, not least because I've never sought, and I would hope he would never use to use it as a political football, and we have been putting enormous effort into the rehousing effort. Of the 202 households from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk which required rehousing, every one has accepted an offer of either high-quality temporary accommodation or permanent accommodation. 196 have moved in, 181 have moved into their permanent home, and 15 remain in temporary accommodation. 6 households remain in emergency accommodation, only 2 in hotels and 3 in serviced apartments, and 1 is living with family or friends. Now these are people with whom there is a constant and ongoing conversation about their needs and requirements. And we cannot, and we are taking this very slowly and sensitively, we cannot compel anybody to do anything. We are working closely with them to try and make sure they get the homes they need. And it's unfair of him to try and make out that we're being dilatory in that effort.
The Minister does himself a disservice. He does the government a disservice. He does the Grenfell survivors a disservice. When, just as I said at the start, the story he tries to tell by the use of those figures he's just given the House is so at odds with the experience of those people who've been affected by the fire. I will give way to my friend.
Would Madam Friend agree with me that there is a fundamental imbalance in the fact that the Persimmons of this world are gaining all of those benefits from being involved in the housing market, but that the tenants in places like Grenfell are getting a really, really rough deal?
Well, it's the most obvious sign of a broken market, isn't it, Mr Deputy Speaker, when you have house builders making bumper profits and bumper bonuses, building homes that ordinary workers can't afford to buy. But these are the fundamental facts. These are the hard truths about the Conservative record on housing, which ministers can't deny, can't disguise, and come the next election, the Conservative Party will not be able to dodge. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, no wonder with this record after 9 years. When you ask people across the country, nearly 3 in 4 believe the country has a housing crisis. And of course, they're right. Everyone knows someone who can't get the home they need or they desire. They'll say the crisis is getting worse, not better, and they are right. And even many Conservatives have now lost faith in the free market fundamentalism about housing because it's failing. It's failing on all fronts. And so that's the reason Conservatives have been losing the argument and forced to cede ground to Labour, from legislating to outlaw letting fees, to banning combustible cladding on the side of high-rise blocks, to lifting the cap, of course, on council borrowing to build new homes. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, these are baby steps, and the biggest roadblock to the radical changes needed to fix the housing crisis for millions of people is the Conservative Party itself. And it's largely the same ideologically inflexible Conservative culprits who are making the Prime Minister's life so difficult over Brexit who will not countenance the government action that's needed to deal with the other big challenges our country faces on social care, on falling real wages, on deep regional divides and, of course, on housing. So after 9 years, Mr Deputy Speaker, we must conclude that the Conservatives in government cannot fix the housing crisis, and it will fall to a Labour government to do that. So here is the plan. We will build 1 million genuinely affordable homes over 10 years, the majority for social rent, with the biggest council house building programme in this country for nearly 40 years. We will reset grant for affordable housing to at least £4 billion a year, scrap the Conservative so-called affordable rent and establish a new Labour definition linked to local incomes and not to the market. We will stop the huge hemorrhage of social rented homes by halting the right to buy and ending the government's forced conversions to affordable rent. We will end rough sleeping within 5 years, with 8,000 new homes available for those with a history of rough sleeping and a £100 million programme for emergency winter accommodation to help prevent people dying on our streets. We will legislate so that renters have new rights to indefinite tenancies, to new minimum standards, to controls on rents and to tougher enforcement. And we will give young people on ordinary incomes the home ownership hope they deserve, with first buy homes, mortgage costs linked to a third of local incomes and first dibs on new homes in their area. I give way to my honourable friend before I finish.
Thank you, honourable friend, for giving way. And I'm sure that this is already on his radar, but disability groups in Bristol are very worried about the shortage of accessible homes in the UK. They say there's something like 1.8 million households who require some sort of adaptations or access features to their homes, and very few of them get that at the moment. So is that part of the future Labour government's plan to build more accessible homes?
It is indeed, and if my honourable friend looks at the big green paper plan that Labour has published, Housing for the Many, we don't just talk about building more, we talk about building better, doing what the public sector has often done in the past, build to better standards. We want these to be the highest standards of design, of accessibility, of energy efficiency, of high tech, so that in future Labour's affordable homes become people's best choice, not their last resort. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, we will create a fully fledged new department for housing, both to reflect the scale of the crisis and to drive our national New Deal on housing. Labour's long-term plan for housing that can help fix our country's housing crisis. Mr Deputy Speaker, where this government has failed, a Labour government will bring the radical change that so many millions of people now want and need.